International organizations are now sounding the alarm on Australia's debt, our spending, and also our housing mess. It has officially become a global concern. Hey guys, Scott here. Look, I do a lot of videos on the budget, government spending, taxes creeping up, and the housing crisis getting worse. And lately, it feels like that's been the entire news cycle. Everyone's arguing over the May budget, over the alarming debt levels, over how broken housing is. And meanwhile, Aussies are just trying to survive the basics. But here's what changed this week. This whole mess has grown so big that it's not just Aussies yelling into the void anymore. One of the biggest international economic groups on the planet, the OECD, has stepped in and basically said, all right, enough. We need to talk about what you're doing. And when an international body has to publish a report telling your government to get its act together on spending, on debt, and housing, that is not a good look. That's the kind of thing that makes you realize the lucky country law is starting to feel like a bedtime story that we tell ourselves. Now, I'm not going to drag you through 100 pages of OECD report because nobody wakes up and thinks, mate, I'd love a 38-page lecture with my coffee. What I will do is pull out the parts that actually matter to your life so that you don't have to read the full report. We'll start with the good stuff they said, because yes, there is some. Then we'll get into the parts where they basically warn that if we don't tighten up spending and fix housing properly, we will be heading into a nasty decade. And I'll explain it in plain English with the numbers and with what it means for your wallet. Quick one before we start. If you want property and the Aussie economy explained without the spin, subscribe and hit the bell. I do these updates every single day. All right, let's get into it. Before we get into the criticism, the OECD actually did give Australia credit for a couple of things, and this matters because it sets up everything they say next. They said Australia managed to bring inflation down from the post-pandemic surge without blowing up the job market, and that was good. In simple terms, prices went up, rates went up, households felt the squeeze, but we avoided the kind of unemployment spike other countries have had. This is a big positive. They also pointed out why rate changes hurt Aussies so quickly. In Australia, a lot of mortgages are on variable rates, so when the RBA moves, repayments jump almost immediately. That pain hits fast, households pull back spending, and inflation cools quicker than in countries where fixed rates delay the impact for years. And here's the key point. Even with all that pressure, mortgage arrears did not explode. Most households kept paying their mortgage, even if it meant cutting back hard in other areas of the household budget. So the OECD's message here is pretty clear. Aussies have already absorbed a massive amount of pain, and that's exactly why the government can't afford to keep piling on more pressure onto households through bad spending and also broken housing policies. And that's where the report stops being polite and starts getting very uncomfortable for our government. After acknowledging a few strong points, the international report gets very blunt very quickly, and this is where things turn uncomfortable for the government. The biggest red flag is government spending. Specifically, that spending is growing much faster than the economy itself. The standout example is the NDIS disability scheme. Treasury's own numbers show it is expected to cost around $50.8 billion next financial year. And on the current path, it will overtake the age pension within a decade. That would make it the single most expensive social program in the country. The issue isn't support for people who need it. The issue is that spending has been growing at rates that are simply not sustainable. At one point, the annual growth rate of NDIS spending was running close to 20% a year. Even the government has admitted that is way too high and has promised to slow it down. They said they first want to slow it down to 8%, and they're now saying they want to get it closer to 5 to 6%. The international warning is clear. If spending continues to grow faster than the economy, debt doesn't just rise, it will accelerate. And once debt starts compounding like that, governments lose room to move. Every crisis becomes harder to manage, every future budget gets tighter, and households eventually will wear the cost. That's why the report uses such strong language about debt being on a steep upward path if spending isn't brought under control. This isn't ideology, it is basic math. And once spending becomes locked in at these levels, the next pressure point will be unavoidable. All right, now we get into the bit that should make you angry, because this is where the report basically says Australia's tax system is lazy. Right now, Australia leans way too hard on income tax, which is a fancy way of saying if you're an everyday Aussie earning a wage, you're the one the system keeps squeezing. When the government needs more money, Australia doesn't spread the load evenly across the economy. It mostly goes back to workers and salary earners because that's the easiest lever to pull. Now, the report doesn't just complain, it actually throws a bunch of suggestions on the table, and some of them are politically explosive. One is the GST. It basically says Australia should consider and must consider broadening the GST and even lifting the GST rate above 10%, and then using the extra revenue to take pressure off income tax. It even claims that kind of reform could make the economy bigger over time because it shifts the tax base away from wages and into spending. Another big one is property taxes, and this matters for housing too. The report says stamp duty is a terrible tax because it punishes people for moving. So what happens? People stay stuck, they don't downsize, they don't relocate for work, they don't move to something that actually fits their life because the stamp duty bill is so brutal, it's so big, it feels like a penalty for doing nothing at all. So the report backs the idea of moving away from stamp duty and shifting towards some form of land tax because a land tax doesn't slap you in the face every time you want to move. Now, I'm not saying I love every one of these ideas. Some of them will sting and these will be very, very unpopular. But the bigger message is this: we've built a system where the government keeps spending like crazy, then turns around and acts shocked when the budget is ugly, and then it's everyday Aussies who get leaned on to actually fill the hole in this budget through higher taxes. Now let's get into housing. This is where the report basically says Australia has let the situation get totally out of control and it's now hurting living standards. It points out that housing is too expensive in many Aussie cities and the fix is boring but obvious. Build more homes, build them faster, and allow more density where people actually want to live. So it talks about easing land use restrictions, bringing in planning reforms, and making it easier to build denser housing in well-located areas. It also calls for more ambition on affordable and social housing. It points out that social housing is about 4% of Australia's housing stock, down from around 6% in 1990, and roughly about half the average across comparable wealthy countries. So when politicians act like they're building a safety net, this report is basically saying the safety net has shrunk and is not keeping up. And the reason this matters is bigger than just housing. When housing is this expensive, it causes overcrowding, financial stress, long commutes, and it makes it harder for people to move for work. It drags the whole economy down. So yeah, this isn't just a property issue. It's now a national competitiveness issue and a national economic issue that needs to be solved. Okay, so let's wrap this up. When an international club of rich countries is publishing a report saying Australia needs urgency on spending, tax, and housing, that's not a flex. This is a warning. It's basically saying Australia still has high living standards, but the cracks are showing. Real incomes got smashed after inflation, mortgage pain hit hard, and housing has become a long-running mess that governments keep failing to fix. And what frustrates me is this: every time the government spends big and loses control of the budget, the cleanup job doesn't land on politicians. It lands on Aussies. It lands through taxes. It impacts cost of living. It impacts housing stress. And this is because of years of falling behind with bad policy. So if you felt like the lucky country doesn't feel so lucky anymore, you're not imagining it. Now you've got outsiders looking in and saying the same thing. So tell me in the comments, what do you think? Should we be shifting away from stamp duty? Should income tax be carrying this much of the load? And do you trust this government to fix housing when it's already gone this far? Do you agree with any of the suggestions in this report? Thanks for watching. I do these videos every day, breaking down property and the economy, what it means for your future, and how it impacts your financial freedom. If you want to stay ahead of the news and think like a property insider, hit subscribe and hit the bell. I'll see you guys at the next video.